Consumed. Welcome back and welcome to this session, the right to freedom of expression of minorities in a digital environment. Now, it won't have escaped your attention that this conference is being carried along by a number of powerful currents. The wellspring of the conference, of course, is technology-induced change, or more specifically, internet-induced change, or rather changes. Changes in communicative practices and patterns at several different levels: interpersonal, intergroup, international, maybe even intergalactic. Who knows who's out there and tuning in. Changes in how we understand the right to freedom of expression as enshrined in aging, creaking international and European human rights treaties, and as interpreted in contemporary internet-dominated times. Changes in how freedom of expression and emerging digital media should be regulated in a way that balances a panoply of public policy objectives and ultimately ensures that there's an appropriate enabling environment for all kinds of media to function optimally in democratic society. And those changes may lead to self- and co-regulatory approaches as opposed to more traditional forms, in some instances at least. And changes also in social expectations on the reach of freedom of expression and the purpose of potential regulation, and so on. This conference engages with some very big themes, big global questions: internet governance, the future of copyright. That's a topic that exercises the minds of bureaucrats in Brussels and teenagers in their online activities. It's got huge appeal. So some of you may be asking, what are minorities doing here with a slot of their own? And, ladies and gentlemen, it will be our great pleasure this afternoon to tell you precisely why we've got our own slot. But first of all, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone here, we're very grateful to Dunya and Andre and the whole organizational team for facilitating us in this way. They appreciated the importance of the issues and gave us this slot. Now, I'm in great company here today. I've got leading experts to help me to explain and explore the specific features of minorities' right to freedom of expression in a digital context. And crucially is that word explore. We would be very much grateful for you to engage with us, offer your insights into what we want to discuss with you. This is, I suppose by way of background, this is part of a broader research project that's driven by a team of experts, including a number of people here today, and that has been very importantly supported by the Office of the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. We've already presented ongoing research in minority-specific circles, and this is a wonderful opportunity for us to engage with media experts of all kinds. So, as I say, I'm in great company. First of all, I've got the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities, Mr. Knut Vollebæk. He will be our first speaker today. He will give you a good sense of why certain specific aspects of minorities' right to freedom of expression are distinctive from those of other groups in society, and he will relate that particularly to his own activities. I'm sure he'll give us a few words of introduction to his specific mandate within the OSCE mechanisms. After that, we will be moving to Dr. Miria Georgiou, who is a leading expert on, amongst other things, diasporic media and the complexity of the dynamics at play there. So she will be explaining, she's based at the London School of Economics, and she will be talking us through some of the complexities of minorities' engagement with the media and these interweaving currents between more traditional forms of media and social media and what the relevant distinctions between them are. Following that, we'll have Dr. Gavin Titley, who is a lecturer at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, and he will have, again, a leading expert on questions such as the interface between racism, media, hate speech, and a whole range of issues relating to multiculturalism. So he will talk us through racist hate speech online and the limitations of that concept. Following that, we will have Professor Tom Mooring, who is a professor at the University of Helsinki, and with, and again, an internationally renowned expert on many things, but in particular, for today's purposes, the use of language and minority languages in the media. He will be treating us to insights into perhaps some broader cultural specificities of minorities' right to freedom of expression, and then he will zoom in on more concretely linguistic issues. And then finally, and here you'll see a bit of a transition from more general presentations to something much more specific, we've got Dr. Bea Bodrogi, who is a leading expert and activist in the field of freedom of expression, media freedom, and the rights of vulnerable groups in society. And today she will be focusing on the position of the Roma, and she will be exploring the particular dynamics between media representation of Roma and their ability to control their own narratives, and she will do so partly based on a specific case study. My own name is Tarla McGonigal. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam, and my task today is to facilitate everything and snarl appropriately if people go over their allocated time limit. But as I say, we very much want to reach out to you, engage you into the debate, so we're looking forward to a very lively discussion in due course. I think one important thing, just to not to abuse my time, but one important thing to stress is that when we're talking about freedom of expression and recent developments in freedom of expression and media freedom, I described them earlier as very powerful currents. Very often there's a sense that we're left in the slipstream of change and that we're trying to catch up. Now, lots of these technology-driven developments are obviously of very general relevance, but in certain circumstances they can have particular consequences for minorities. Something that will undoubtedly come up later is whether hate speech online is qualitatively or quantitatively different to the offline variant. Something else that will come up is whether the specific informational needs and preferences of minorities are adequately fulfilled in an online context, particularly from a linguistic point of view. Is material available? Can they use the internet-based resources adequately to fulfill their information needs and their communicative needs? And finally, just to give one more example, even though the promise of digital television is enormous for pluralism, its practical impact is often somewhat limited. And from a minority's point of view, there may well be a possibility to set up digital broadcasting or digital media entities. But what prominence will they achieve after the switch over to digital television? So as you can see, these are just examples, but there are a lot of examples where more general developments, both in terms of changing practice and changing regulation and policy, can have very specific effects and consequences for minorities. I've said enough, and it's my great pleasure to invite the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Talek. For one, I'm very happy that the position of minorities in media is part of this conference. I think it's very important, and I can assure you that this is a subject that comes up quite often in my work. Thank you. I guess you might say that in general, there is not much difference between ensuring freedom of expression for minorities and majorities as a matter of principle. However, as you also referred to in your introduction, some challenges to freedom of expression have a specific dimension for minorities, and others are unique to them. For example, minorities may lack political or economic power, or face discrimination because they speak a different language and belong to smaller groups. Specifically, I would like to address three issues related to minorities and the media that are relevant to my work in conflict prevention. The first is minority languages in the media, then the role the media can play in integrating societies, and thirdly, the implications of new technologies. But first, let me underline in general terms the real risk of conflict that arises when the rights and interests of minority groups are not sufficiently taken into account. This may seem an obvious point to make, but it is crucial and often underestimated and under-researched. The exclusion of minorities from the media landscape constitutes a threat not only to the survival of the languages and cultures of minorities, but also to their integration as full members of society. Equally dangerous is the promotion of negative stereotypes in the media, or even the dissemination of hate speech, as I understand you addressed earlier today, as this can contribute to an explosive situation that may ultimately lead to large-scale violence. I witnessed this happening in Kyrgyzstan before the conflict erupted in 2010, and I still see it happening in other contexts. The first issue I would like to discuss with you today is the precarious position of minority languages in the media. This has been a focus of my institution since the first High Commissioner, Max van der Stoel, took up office 20 years ago. In order to maintain and develop cultural and linguistic identities, access to the media in minority languages is as important as, for example, the right to minority education. Moreover, if persons belonging to national minorities do not have access to media in their own languages, they may miss out on vital information that can obstruct their access to social, economic, and political opportunities on an equal footing with the majority. Unfortunately, some states approach language policy as a zero-sum game in which the official language, often defined as the language spoken by the majority, is promoted at the expense of minority languages through stringent language quota, inspections, selective budget allocations, and other restrictions. Such policies infringe on human and minority rights standards. This is made clear in the 2003 H&M guidelines on the use of minority languages in the broadcast media and other international standards. I have seen that any policy that aims to strengthen an official language at the expense of minority languages will ultimately be counterproductive. This approach weakens integration and respect for diversity. In my work, I strongly advise governments to adopt policies that aim to include rather than exclude minority languages in the media. This means rejecting restrictive language policies that limit the ability of minorities to present and express themselves in the media. Removing restrictions also enables the rest of society to learn more about the minorities with whom they share a common country. Second, and related to the first point, is the role the media can and should play in integrating societies. I work in many countries that are divided along ethnic, religious, and/or linguistic lines, and I see that the media landscape often reflects the same divisions. Since minorities belong to smaller groups that tend to have less economic and political power, minority media outlets often fail to achieve the necessary critical mass, particularly in times of economic hardship. State policies to encourage the media to promote and reflect the diversity within society are therefore essential. States should also consider policies to support minority media outlets which face higher costs and lower revenues. As my recent guidelines on integration of diverse societies underline, state policies should also strive to challenge negative stereotypes and counter intolerance. In addition, when states neglect their duty to promote meaningful access to the media for all, persons belonging to minorities can be left with only one source of information, namely the media of neighboring states. This can only widen existing divisions within society and could contribute to bilateral tensions. Yet, these issues can be addressed with relatively few resources. One of my projects in the Armenian-populated region of Georgia showed that simple initiatives can have a wide impact. This can include subtitling national news programs in minority languages, rebroadcasting programs in relevant regions, and supporting the production of local news. When minority communities are better informed about the social and political life of the country they live in, they tend to find it easier to integrate. My third point regards the effects that new technology may have on minority media. New media are often heralded as the saviors of minority media. Some say that the internet and other technological advances have cut the costs of production and opened access to the media to all. Unfortunately, my experience is quite different. While the internet and other new media do present exciting new opportunities, new media do not necessarily ease access for minorities, and the interests of minorities still need to be taken into account and actively protected. One example is when states switch to digital radio and television, as was mentioned here. This process is controlled at the political level and has huge economic consequences. It is important to ensure that minorities are not excluded from this process. In addition, while the internet is open to everyone, it tends to favor majority languages, cultures, and preferences. Because minority languages, cultures, and points of view can easily find themselves marginalized, investment in quality journalism needs to be directed to minority as well as majority media outlets. It is also important to encourage public broadcasters to consider representing minorities in their programming. It is essential that states ensure that their media landscape reflects the diversity of their societies in terms of language, culture, and opinions. States need to be proactive. They have to adopt the relevant legal frameworks and policies, invest in training journalists and opening accessibility, and commit sufficient resources. The private sector can also contribute to creating a more open and representative media landscape. Ensuring an inclusive media environment is not only a question of promoting a healthy democracy, ensuring good governance or representing international obligations, or respecting international obligations. It is crucial if we want to promote peaceful and stable societies in which all groups can play their part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. That's a great start to the panel by providing with such rich contextual detail of the specificities of minorities' right to freedom of expression. We immediately see there that we're dealing with very, very complex relationship. On the one hand, media have the power to exacerbate existing divisions in society. But on the other hand, they equally have the power to ameliorate those differences and contribute to preventive endeavours as far as conflict is concerned. For example, by providing fora in which different groups in society can get together and actually connect at a communicative level and exchange views and opinions. I think it's very, very valuable that you have drawn the link to linguistic rights and the broader problematic of integration, because there again, the media and freedom of expression are crucial rights and tools for playing a positive role. And in continuation of the contextual approach that we're taking, it's now my great pleasure to invite Dr. Mirja Georgiou to take the floor. And again, without introducing any spoilers, what she will be emphasizing is the importance not just to chase developments and fashions and fads in the media, but to see any new developments in the broader, more comprehensive context of what has gone before. Because as of yet, we cannot really talk about internet replacing the existing media offer. Rather, the dynamics are those of displacement. To some extent, there is continuity and complementarity, but on other occasions, there's a certain amount of differentiation and disruption. But she can put it much better than I can. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So it's great to be here, and indeed, I'll put it up in a second. Indeed, I think Tarlak offered a good bridge, because indeed what I am going to be talking about is the ordinary and the banal. So in many ways, I'm going to talk about much less exciting things, much more what might sound initially as not as burning issues, not as important political issues as, for example, we heard in the previous panel in relation to the hate speech. However, I'm going to argue that by looking at the ordinary and the banal, the space of everyday life, the space of communication, rather than the fascination with the new, rather than the fascination with the internet revolution, looking into mediated communication, what this discussion is all about, we might be able to understand what people actually do with the internet, among other media, and what are the cultural and political implications. So I'm breaking away somehow from the discussion that focuses on those chilling moments that require immediate action from us, such as the moments of the hate speech, the big media events, and to look at what happens in the space of everyday life. I want to also continue, though, breaking from this discourse, I want to continue from where the Commissioner started by saying that, in principle, when we talk about minorities, we're not talking about something completely different. We're all minorities in one or another way, and we're all members of certain majorities in one or another context. And I will add to that, that in the same way as minorities are not per se different to everything else, the same goes with the internet. The internet, a lot of the discourse on the internet, a lot of our fears and hopes about the internet were expressed in the early 20th century about radio, and the same fears were expressed about television in the 1950s. So that's why I find it much more intriguing in a way to locate my research on what people actually do with the internet and with other media. So what I will talk in the very little time that I have, and thus please allow me to make some generalization, and I'm going to offer some ideas which are thrown for discussion rather than endpoints and very sophisticated endpoints, is to talk about those converged spaces of communication that might be about the internet as a converged medium where people can do different things, but also the converged space of communication that might include the internet and the television and the press and all the other things that people do when they use the internet as well. So we're talking about converged media spaces, and many people have spoken about that. But what I would like to look at is not the converged media space in relation to technology, but those spaces as converged spaces of identity and citizenship. And I think this is the case with this new converged media environment that we look at, and many of the challenges and many of the policy challenges discussed also in previous panels relate to this convergence. How do you address issues of hate speech when the issues you are addressing are sitting between cultural life and political life? How do you address issues of education when education can be such a diluted concept within different areas of our lives? However, I'm looking at this space because I think there are specific implications about the way that we think about citizenship and identity, and I'm going to focus in three different implications that are particular about minorities, again, not as a distinct group, but as a group, as the Commissioner put it, that has that we usually talk about because of the specific characteristics which I emphasize in this case. One of those specific characteristics is the usual are the problems of marginalization and exclusion from many other kinds of media or exclusion for the mainstream public spheres. So the first implication that I want to highlight, if I find where is that? Yeah. No, sorry. There it is. Okay, the first implication I want to highlight is that of the converged media as a space of converged space of the different kinds of representation. So what we see in this convergent environment is a convergence of the cultural representation, i.e. identity, and the political representation, i.e. questions of citizenship, addressing questions of exclusion in relation to exclusion from systems of citizenship, but also trying to find what is interesting, I think, when you look at minorities and this new media environment, is the way that minorities might try to use these different converged media environments to find ways of these different kinds of representation. And what I just put up there for your reference, and I'm not going to discuss this in detail, is some brutal categorization that comes out of the different projects I have done with different minority groups about what people actually do with the different media. And I think what you will see here is things that we all do with the media, but again, which also have some distinct relevance when it comes to marginalized groups, when it comes to minorities. And what I want to highlight, the reason I put these different things here, is that minorities use media for all different ways. And they use the internet and other media in different ways in looking inwards looking to engage with issues that relate to identity and self-representation, for looking sideways so that they can create spaces of communication and contact with other groups, but also to look outwards. And in many ways, I think, and that's also, I think, very important, media work as a kind of interpreter, as a bridge or a translator to reach out to different groups that many, not only minorities, but many groups don't have access to. So there is a lot that happens there, and I think what is important here is we have a fragmented but also a unitary space of communication. And if we think about freedom of speech, democracy, and communication, I think we have to accept that this fragmentation is necessary for any kind of, for addressing any issues of freedom of speech, expression, and democratic participation. The second issue I want to raise is that of media literacy, and media literacy has been an issue that has been raised also in different panels. And I think that if we think about the different ways that minorities use the media, we realize yet again how media literacy, the way, the skills, the capacities, the critical understanding of the media become necessary tools for citizenship, for participation in any society, to make sense of an increasingly mediated world. So I think it's important to recognize the multiple significance of media literacy, but also to problematize it, as other people have done in previous sessions. And the third point that I will offer here is one of the ways in which we need to problematize media literacy. Some people criticized the concept of media literacy before because partly it moves away the responsibility of who guarantees equality, who guarantees freedom of expression, moves away the responsibility from policymakers and states to individuals. Some people criticize media literacy because it can become an empty concept. And I think, indeed, no matter where we come in, which way we come in media literacy, this is indeed a very difficult concept. And I think studies on minorities offer us some ways in making sense of media literacy and making sense of it in a tangible and useful way, especially for marginalized groups. In many of the projects I worked with, and the recent one, I have a documentary if anybody wants to take a copy here, with Arab audiences across Europe. What we have seen, in this case as in others, but especially in this research, is that among diasporic, migrant, minority groups, we see a quite high level of media literacy. And it might not be the media literacy that we see in the EU documents or the media literacy that we see on the level of national government, but it's the media literacy, I think, that appears as a tactic that marginalized groups develop because of their inability to have, not an inability, because of their lack of access to the main stage of the media and communication, from their lack of access, marginalization in mainstream media, they develop those skills to navigate their media world and make more sense of. And how do they do that? For example, just to say two examples. One has to do with the media-savvy transnational audiences. Minorities tend to be multilingual. Minorities are more likely to consume media from different regions, from different cultural environments, in different languages. And this practice ends up creating much more awareness about the politics of the media, the politics and ideologies that are debated and presented in the media. And of course, the second way that media literacy develops is through the producer, the identity that many minorities adapt, often like many young people. I think we see here a generational and a cultural link between young people and people who have those transnational connections, is the constant practice of using new media, especially the internet, both as producers and as consumers, producing content, disseminating, but also consuming it. And this is somehow, I think, a response to the silence and stereotyping of minorities in the mainstream media. So the real struggles take place very often in these very ordinary and banal ways that minorities try to navigate the internet and in which they try to find their way. And just to conclude then, when it comes to policy, I think these are the way that if we look at these very ordinary practices, we might indeed manage to make sense of the usefulness of concepts such as media literacy, but also to try to make sense about these fragmented environments of mediated communication that somehow frighten us. Very often we feel that fragmented spaces might necessarily lead to conflict, but more often than that, what they create is these points of contact, but also these points for marginalized groups to both seek and develop their spaces of identity and articulate their own understanding of citizenship in different spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I react to your very valuable presentation, an important housekeeping message. This room, we know from earlier sessions, tends to get very, very warm. If any of you would like us to open either the door or the window, please try and catch my attention or Mr. Jinx's attention here, and either one of us will try and just relieve the situation. Do you need to have the window open already, or is it okay for the moment? Okay, perhaps we could open it for a minute or two, just to keep the oxygen and discussion alive. Thank you very much for that presentation. You brought us back down to the everyday, and you mentioned that that's banal, but it's also crucial because that's what's happening in real terms. And very often we can have preconceived ideas about how particular individuals or groups use the media, but very often when you get into the detail of actual research and empirical research, we can be very surprised in what is actually taking place. And that was a very good example that certain diasporic communities certainly tend to be more media literate than other groups in society for a whole range of reasons. And I think it's very important also in the context of the High Commissioner's remarks about integration and the media as a vehicle for integration, that you insisted on the fragmented and unitary communicative spaces, because very often what happens in intra-group communication is important for intergroup communication in a broader sense. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Gavin Titley. Another panelist told me that you had 27 pages, so I better not introduce you further and just give the word to yourself.
What? It was not me. I lost some of them on the way here, thankfully. Hannah Arendt once made the point that anti-Semitism doesn't depend on the presence of Jews. And a friend of mine updated this recently by asking, how can Iceland have an active community of anti-Muslim bloggers in the absence of a Muslim population in Iceland? And in a way, the research that I've been looking at over the last few years has been attempted to think these things together. How do we look at the specificities and affordances of social networking, of interactive media, of convergent media, and hold them together with the kinds of racist exclusions and new hierarchies of belonging which have emerged in European political cultures over the last 10, 20 years or so. So some of my comments are going to be looking at that in relation to the questions which are foregrounded in this panel. And one way to start looking at that is to look at and to think about some of the ways in which digital technologies and interactive media are often celebrated. And there's particular reasons for celebrating them when it comes to the questions around minority participation and minority communicative participation, which in national broadcasting mainstream media systems have always involved the question as to how do minorities, how do the few, how are they represented, how do they engage in media systems which are organized as the few communicating to the many anyway. So many of the very kind of classical debates around participation and ability to address different kinds of audiences, around representation, who gets to represent and how is dignity affected by different kinds of representations, around diversity and pluralism, who gets to represent different communities and what kind of different voices exist within different communities, and how can representative media systems amplify them and give them space. A lot of those classic questions that we associate with mainstream media structures are, of course, ameliorated and addressed by digital communicative possibilities. But those questions, of course, don't go away, and that's where Tom is going to come in, I think, with some of these questions, and they'll be part of what Bea looks at as well. But one of the things which has certainly been, I think, scotched or discredited over the last years is some of the early internet utopianism about the idea of the internet as a space that is disembodied, where identities can be left behind, where you can be someone without the meat, as the phrase used to be. And as many people have pointed out, one of the things that characterizes online engagements and characterizes the dynamics in online spaces is that existing inequalities are translated. They're not exactly the same, they're not reflected in exactly the same, but existing inequalities, existing forms of marginalization, existing forms of inequality are mediated and reflected in online spaces as well. As a colleague of mine, Sanjay Sharma, put it, social networking relations, he argues, modes of online communication and digital identities have been revealed to be far from race neutral. And we could say the same about gender, we could say the same about sexuality, bodily ability, and so forth. So if the offline and the online are not separate, and we get the translation of these established inequalities and imbalances of power that carry over, but are also transformed and extended, then one of the things that comes up constantly in research on minority participation in social media, and particularly in my own research with young activists and people from different minority backgrounds, is the question of different kinds of freedom of participation and how we think about freedom of participation. And one of the issues to emerge over the last few years is the idea of a new digital divide, meaning that previously when we understood the digital divide, it was about questions of imbalances of access to technology and technological infrastructures. One of the points that's made about the kinds of exclusion that work in and through social media interaction is that new forms of digital divide are not about access to technology. They're not about, if you like, the physical capacity or material capacity to participate, but they are about the ability to participate online with dignity and to participate online in ways that you can flourish. And this is threatened by the forms of harassment and the different dynamics of harassment which can be witnessed within different kinds of online spaces. So what this would suggest is that when we come to classic debates about freedom of expression versus regulation, that I am in some ways falling down on the side which suggests that speech acts are acts, they are consequential acts, and they have the ability to injure and harm. But this is not to say that this needs to become a question of government regulation. Instead, one of the things that I'm interested in and one of the things I've been researching, and it's something that came up in the previous panel, is how different groups mobilize online, how they look at interactive spaces as political spaces that involve strategies to combat the kind of harassment that they are exposed to, and how online strategies map onto and become part of offline political strategies at the same time. So one of the things that is important at this is looking at the ways in which, and one of the things I'm researching at the moment is a project with the Council of Europe have started with youth activists all over Europe called Combating Hate Speech Online, and looking at the way in which they develop strategies which are adequate to the interactive spaces that are valuable to them. So in other words, some of these strategies are very opportunistic, some of them are very spontaneous. Many people will be familiar here with the Muslim Rage hashtag and the way in which Newsweek, for example, looked to boost its sales by having a particularly nasty iconographic image on the cover and then invite people to talk about Muslim Rage under the hashtag. And this was hijacked by people quite spontaneously. So jokes which circulated on the internet like, you lose your child called Jihad in the airport and you can't shout for them, Muslim Rage. So there was a very spontaneous hijacking and turning back of the dynamics which Newsweek was trying to cultivate. Other forms of strategies are much more targeted to making certain kinds of spaces safe online, either through moderation or through exclusion, by saying this is our space and our space alone. So in other words, classic emancipatory strategies of guaranteeing your own space, which were part of the women's movement, which were part of anti-racism movements in the pre-digital age, are replicated online for particular periods of time and for particular reasons. But to move on slightly, one of the things that I want to suggest, and coming back to the question that Miria raised about actually starting from looking at what people do, is that we actually have very little research about what people do online when it comes to questions of racism, hate speech, and harassment. There's an awful lot of supposition, there's an awful lot of talking from normative principles, but there's very little research in terms of what people actually do. One of the reasons for this is that research, internet research, has remained to a large extent, not exclusively, but to a large extent, fixed on the hate site as a unit of research. So in other words, the hate site, the extremist group, becomes the locus of thinking about racism and the generation of racist ideas. And it's the site which is studied, rather than, if you like, the way in which that site is embedded and networked into a wider ecology. And therefore, different ideas, different modes of communication travel to and from it. That's not to say that it's not important to study the far right and extremist sites in Europe. A recent report by the Institute of Race Relations in London, for example, showed the way in which internet-based movements, particularly defence leagues around Europe, have not just been able to become offline movements, but have begun to network with each other in ways which weren't possible before. And this replicates very much the study of, for example, American extremist sites in the 1990s, looking at the ways in which they were able to develop recruiting strategies which quite obviously weren't available before. But what I want to argue is that this focus fails to kind of capture the dynamics and transformative nature of social media platforms. In other words, there's a tendency very often when it comes to thinking about hate speech or when it comes to thinking about racism to assume that when we see something communicated, that it simply reflects or captures an expression of a kind of pre-existing pool of prejudice or a pre-existing snapshot of public attitudes. And I think that we really need to address that in research terms to look at how dynamic forms of communication, interactive forms of communication, work in particular contexts and work in real time. I give you an example of the by now well-known Twitter hashtags in France, which attracted such kind of official condemnation and official criticism from government downwards. But one of the things this did, of course, was it also intensified the dynamic of participation in and through that hashtag. The hashtag was not a simple reflection of pre-existing homophobia or pre-existing anti-Semitism, but is part of a dynamic communicative political process where we need to understand those dynamics, but also understand the political culture in which this becomes possible. Second example, we've had a lot of comment of a particular kind and why this has become, if you like, an economic imperative in the new media economy at the same time. I don't know how much time I have left, Harlot, but should I? Could wrap up. Okay. So one of the things then perhaps we can discuss when we start to look at the need to take on board medium properties, to look at media dynamics in real time when it comes to the analysis of hateful communications or comes to thinking about the extension and shaping of racism online, is some of the limitations of the concept of hate speech to do certain analytical things when it comes to this. And there was beginnings of a very good discussion about that, I think, in the previous panel. I won't say much about it now, other than to say this. If you look at, for example, the focus after what happened in Norway on 22/7 on the online, globally sort of distributed online anti-Muslim blogging networks, some of which are, we call them blogs, which makes them appear as if it's just something somebody put on a WordPress site. But some of these blogs actually have budgets which medium-sized media enterprises would be quite happy to have on an annual basis. If you look at this as an ecosystem, one of the things that has happened with it over time is they define themselves against the hate-speaking community. They define themselves as human rights activists. They define themselves as scholars whose truth is being ignored by the mainstream. They create an entirely parallel epistemology based on the production of facts which are being denied by the mainstream, none of which depends on hateful speech, none of which depends on exaggerated speech. Breivik, in his manifesto, defines himself as an anti-racist and as an anti-fascist. Now, for me, this is a challenge, because what we have here is an entire networked structure of hate, which is about making certain populations the problem and the focus of prejudice and the focus, of course, of violence. But we can't explain a lot of this, I think, by only using some of the paradigms which we have established for thinking about hate online or thinking about prejudice online. So those 2 points, the particular affordances of media and thinking about the ways in which this new informational ecosystem allows for different kinds of iterations of racism, I think are crucially important right now.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That was great, and also for offering to wrap up without even being asked. And please try and find those few pages you lost on the way. I'm sure they're equally good. You've done many very important things there. You've also introduced very squarely this notion of participation alongside the earlier broader contextual dimensions of integration and identity. So here again, just realize the context in which freedom of expression is driving forward. And again, one of the issues or challenges that emerged in the previous session in this room was the skepticism about the usefulness and adequacy of strategies coming from a higher normative level to actually having impact on the ground. And you very articulately mentioned the importance of engaging with the specific features and dynamics of the new online interactive spaces. Crucial. And that ties in nicely with Miria's point about media literacy as a tool for ensuring that engagement, because media literacy is often floated around as a vague term, but if you look closely at the existing definitions, such as they are, it's not just about critical analysis of media and media content, but also this notion that Miria mentioned of being a producer as a user, that you also create content. And that was very much in evidence in Gavin's presentation as well, this interactive potential and the need to rethink strategies. Thank you again. Professor Tom Mooring is going to continue this further, and he will be talking again about some of the specific uses of media and online media by minorities. And again, some of the lessons to be learned here are of broader import than the immediate focus.
Thank you, Chair, and honored High Commissioner, honored colleagues. It's really a pleasure to share with you some of the work we have been doing in this field. My reflection generally on what has been going on in this room, I've followed all the sessions here, and we've kind of moved from a regulatory perspective more and more towards in a way a political or sociological perspective, and I'm kind of going to continue this move towards let's say looking at the world around and looking at how we want it to look and then leaving, of course, policymakers and regulators with a whole lot of questions that they earlier on this morning answered that they will not be able to respond to. But that's then a later question that will have to come to more severe debate as a follow-up of this conference. And I'm also very, very happy to be able to provide empirical support for almost every claim that the High Commissioner made. So in this sense, I hope that this will tie in. My view starts to move from a more negative view on what media does to minorities to maybe a more positive view and more potentially constructive view. I realize and I recognize that this viewpoint and this perspective has been here already in this room, and I'm very happy for it, and I'm going to try to strengthen it a little bit further. Now, this person here, a young Hungarian lady, age 2, learns a language. Now she is 2, and she will keep this language with her for 80 years by statistics. This is, of course, an enormous investment. It is interesting to reflect on that her language is a public good. Using it won't wear it out. Using it will strengthen it, and she can share it endlessly without anybody suffering from it. At the same time, she can crave a full language, a full support for her language. She can crave a surrounding where the vitality of her community, the culture that is surrounding her, is supporting her in full. It's not like she's only one, she can have only like 1 word or 10 words, whereas those who are 1,000 should have 1,000 or 10,000 words, and those who are 1 million should have yet more words. That's not how culture works. That's not how language works. These are entities made for sharing. That's also why I would argue that normal market logics are quite dangerous when you talk about minority situations. Because basically, and by definition, to be in a minority position, whichever of the minority positions that Mirja was expressing, and I'm quite with her there, that we are all majority and minority at the same time, but where we are minorities, we are in an asymmetric situation. That means we who speak minority languages, I belong to one of those, I'm a Swedish speaker from Finland, we know Finnish, we know the majority language, but we cannot expect that the majority would know the minority language. And that means that the market mechanisms, also with global communication, tends to press on the minority languages, and that calls for positive action. Without forgetting what was earlier said about the harassment made against minorities, we should not forget this positive perspective. And now, when we are looking at the internet and the internet role in the new media landscape, and here I'm coming back to what the High Commissioner said earlier, that one cannot expect internet to come in instead of a full media landscape with also other types of media, with a full menu of media, if one wants to give a full language context to this little girl of 2 years old, to support her in her life and her cultural development until she is adult and in her adult life. We know that internet changes the media landscape. It carries the old media landscape on its back. It allows media to cross over to carry functions that were earlier not carried by media. But at the same time, we know that people use more and more time with media. We use, I will show you an example just in a second, but we use almost as much time with media as we use for work and as we use for sleep. And it's not unimportant in which language we use this time. And this means, consequentially, that the ideal situation would be that everybody in their language, for their culture, would have an institutionally complete media landscape, where a language is served on a rich range of platform and genre. Of course, one has to be realistic. If I'm going to China as a Swedish-speaking Finn, I cannot demand that they put up a Chinese radio station, a Swedish radio station, TV station, and a newspaper for me, and put up some internet services. That's clear. So there are some realistic considerations to be made, and these are handled in international instruments such as the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, the Buffet Charter, where different options are offered for authorities to, in a decent way, handle discussions of this sort. But this would be the basic hope and consideration in order to maintain language vitality. However, although you have the institutional completeness of a media system, as many minorities actually have rather good services today in media, the media landscape may remain functionally weak. And that means that people anyway opt out of their language community and the services made. Of course, if the services aren't of apt quality, that would be evident, and you could operate with the quality, but that can happen anyway, also in situations where the media landscape is very rich and very, very strong. But it is evident, and we've seen examples empirically of that where you increase offerings in a minority language, also the use raises. So there is not a good a reason for hysterical pessimism here. Quite the opposite. The predictions on how languages fare are often more negative than the empirical evidence where you do something, where you put good policies in place. And we know that where you opt out from services and where you do not give services, you definitely get negative effects, and you get you increase the vulnerability of the linguistic landscape that supports a culture. This is only the evidence of the use of media now here in Scandinavian countries, and I can assure you that the Scandinavian statistics are low in comparison to statistics from many other countries, for example from the United States, from the United Kingdom, or from Southern Europe. Okay, we can think about the different functions carried by media. If we think about radio, it's usually for within the community. A radio station is not very often listened to by people who do not understand the language of the radio station. Of course, music can carry, but otherwise it would be for the people who formulate an opinion, a cultural landscape for themselves. And it's very functional for that. It's cheap, it reaches out broadly, it doesn't require writing skills. Many minority communities are better in speaking than in writing. And it's also today the most usual media for minority groups, at least if we talk about it in a European context and certainly in many other contexts as well. A written press appears to be the most efficient organizer of minority community, and usually is the formative element of the community culture. We've seen many examples of that around Europe. Unfortunately, the written press isn't that common in comparison to radio. Even less common are full-fledged television stations, but where we have them, we see great potential to communicate over the borders of the community. The recent most example of this is the TV station developed in Scotland some years ago, which now just recently went on air so that it doesn't require satellite reception, and is much more viewed outside the Gaelic-speaking community than inside the Gaelic-speaking community, meaning, of course, that the Gaelic-speaking community is there, but the majority of the audience is actually people who wouldn't speak Scottish Gaelic. Think about the cultural value of such a vehicle. That's typical for television. What does internet do? Well, we really do not know yet exactly how internet interferes with this. We see the opportunities, we see the new possibilities, we see the immense activity that is going on, but we also see that there is a problem if communities are left alone and are supposed to do this kind of as a social networking tool, where the big society comes in with huge resources, with an enormous impact factor, and the minority would have to do this kind of on a voluntary basis only and on an amateurish level. So here I would see a great need to do positive enhancement and to take internet into the family of supported cultural platforms in media policies. So, what should be done? Expand the state's obligation to encourage and or facilitate all types of media in terms of a cultural activity and cultural obligation, refute the substitutive use of internet and social media as a solution, and, very problematic but very important, encourage the majority to listen in via media such as television that easily can transgress cultural borders. And size. Does size matter? Well, when we're talking about size of the state, the size of the state apparently, in our observations, do not decide whether the state has a rich or a poor service of the minorities. We see small states doing a lot, such as Norway, partly my home country, Finland. We see big states doing almost nothing, and I won't mention them because that would be embarrassing for those who feel themselves tied to these states, but you can think of yourself which states might be in question. It is not the size of the state, it is the strength of the will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also for that very upbeat note with which you concluded, and also for the discussion later. I think you've raised some crucial points there, something that's a recurrent theme in your own research, this notion of functional completeness of the media offer, and what you specified there at the very end. What positive obligations should states be governed by in this changing media ecology? I'm conscious of the time. I'm going to speed forward to our final speaker, and Dr. Bea Bodrogi is, as I neglected to mention earlier, co-founder of Civil Media, which is an NGO based in Hungary, and it's my great pleasure to give her the floor to take the discussion further.
Thank you very much. In the last few years, my main interest is the media portrayal of disadvantaged groups. And today I'm going to talk about the Roma portrayal, the media portrayal of Roma in the Hungarian media. I'm afraid I can't paint a positive picture today. Roma is the largest ethnic minority in Hungary, living in Hungary. Researchers estimate their numbers at 6 or 8%, and actually this is the issue, the human rights issue of the Roma, in which the Hungary receives the most international criticism beside the new Hungarian media laws. To start with, let me share you with results of two researches. One is conducted by the Viewpoint Institute, and according to their survey, say that 91% of Hungarians agree that gypsy crime exists as a special type of crime, while 77% believe that Roma are more likely to commit crimes than non-Roma. The second research I'm going to talk about is a very recent one conducted by the Hungarian Media Authority. They reviewed news and political programming broadcast by 9 state-funded and 10 commercial TV and radio stations over the first half of 2012. According to this report, women, retired people, persons with disabilities, as well as members of ethnic minorities appear in the news much less frequently than the proportion of the population that each group represents. It also reports that the media image of Roma has deteriorated, as Roma are with increasing frequency portrayed in connection with crime. Another characteristic is that Roma are rarely shown identified by their name and occupation. It was only in about 1/5 of all the cases reviewed that they were accurately presented. As we all know, that the media portrayal is not something that is created in a vacuum. Several factors play important roles in it. And now I would like to talk in short about the environment in which this negative media portrayal of Roma take place. And one factor is the processes that have been taking place in Hungary in the last few years. According to the European Social Survey, trust in democratic institutions has dropped, while an interest in extreme right messages has grown. As you know, an extreme right-wing political party, Jobbik, has seats in the parliament, in the Hungarian parliament. And they are the third most influential party at the moment. At the same time, we can observe growth in prejudice, in particular prejudice attitudes towards Roma, and this is being expressed much more openly. The media image of Hungarian Roma is primarily influenced by political events and statements. Over the last few years, Hungarian public policy has also taken some significant turns in several respects. As I mentioned, that Jobbik, the extreme right political party, has been voted into parliament. Expressions and thematizations such as criminality, parasitism, that was used to describe Roma have now gained legitimacy and are considered acceptable for use in public forums. So this is not surprising that existing norms are being questioned and rewritten. An example of this is gypsy crime, which is used as a descriptive category. Few words about the gypsy crime, which is used in public discourse. In Hungary, construing Roma as criminals is a phenomenon that has been going on for centuries and perpetuated by public policy and public discourse. Up until 1999, gypsy ethnicity was a special earmark used in Hungarian law enforcement. And few words about the voices of the Roma community, because they also play an important role in the media portrayal of Roma. It is true that Roma can be heard in all forms of media, state-funded radio, TV channel, broadcast programs, also in Romani languages. But we can say that the voices of the Roma community is still very weak, and they are not enough to be able to encourage the majority population to take a more realistic and balanced view of the Roma community. Because of all of this, we can say that a much more open racist attitude towards we can watch a much more open racist attitude towards Roma. And this phenomenon is especially flourishing in the digital media, where it had the least chance of having to face any consequences. And let me tell you a recent example. 2000, this year, January, when Zoltán Bayer, Zsolt Bayer, a member of the ruling party Fidesz, close friend of Orbán Viktor, wrote a column in the Hungarian newspaper, a right-wing paper with close ties to the government. And this article was written in response to a crime that was allegedly committed by two young Roma boys. And the article appeared both online and in printed media. So what he said, a significant part of the gypsy population is unfit to live in a community. They are unfit to live among people. These gypsies are animals and behave like animals. When they meet with resistance, they kill. These animals shouldn't be allowed to exist, not under any circumstances. This must be dealt with immediately and by any means necessary. So this article appeared a month ago, and the civil society condemned the writer and the article, and we have started an active discourse on hate speech. And it's also important to tell you that there is no legal consequences of the article. And so here we are in a situation which is in which, this is my opinion, that the civil society couldn't adequately respond to this racist discourse. And on the other hand, the legal remedies are more confusing than clear to clear the issue at the moment. So I finish here with this concrete example.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And again, if I can stand back from your presentation just briefly, what I see here coming through it is the great importance of the media and the ability to access and use the media from the point of view of empowerment, either to challenge dominant narratives and prejudices that are vehicled through the media, and also to control your own narratives and put forward your own identity and discourse. And again, you very importantly referred to the strength and influence of that voice, such as it is. And there we see, through your well-chosen example, the challenges facing law and policy makers to come up with effective strategies to deal with the more, to put it very mildly, unpleasant speech that would target minorities, and sometimes to terrible effect. Okay, it's now my great pleasure to open it up to you. Plenty of food for thought. So what I'll do is I'll take a quick round of 3 questions. I'd please ask you to wait until Mr. Jinks comes to you with the microphone. Please identify yourself and your affiliation, just for the benefit of all present. And please try and be to the point. Okay. I've got one here. Question or comment number 2. Is there a third one? There probably will be in a moment. 3. Okay. So if you could start with the lady there, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Agnes Balla, and I'm a third secretary from the Hungarian Permanent Mission to the OSCE, and I would like to make some comments to Ms. Bea Bodrogi's presentation. And just to clarify some contents of your presentation, thank you for your presentation, first of all. But as a member of the Permanent Mission, I would like to say that the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister of Justice and Public Administration, Mr. Tibor Navracsics, condemned the article aforementioned, published a month ago by Zsolt Bayer in the Magyar Hírlap, which is a daily newspaper. And I can quote that the article published by, and I will quote the minister, that he said, the article published by Zsolt Bayer contains grave statements contradictory to democracy and is the profanation of all democratic principles that Fidesz adheres to. Fidesz is the current governmental ruling the government. And in connection to the Roma policy of the Hungarian government, I can tell you that there is an ongoing discussion with the OSCE. There has been, we presented our national social inclusion strategy within the OSCE in the third dimension, in the Human Dimension Committee, which deals with the human rights issue. And just for your information, today there is a big conference here in Vienna organized by the Hungarian Bilateral Mission and by the Hungarian Permanent Mission to the OSCE on the Hungarian Roma, on the governmental Roma policy. And the minister Zoltán Balogh, who is covering also the Roma issues, he had a bilateral meeting with Andrej Mirga, who is the contact point for Roma and Sinti of the ODIHR. And there will be a conference which will start at 5 o'clock. And if you wish to participate to it, you can come with me to the embassy. And yeah, so the floor is open. And thank you very much. I just wanted to clarify the governmental position. Thank you.
Peter Molnar, Central European University from Budapest, and before a question, a short comment that unfortunately, as you saw on Bea's picture, the Prime Minister himself, the Prime Minister of Hungary himself, hanging out gladly with the guy who wrote that nasty racist article, and it's not his first nasty racist article. And it doesn't save the situation that one of the leaders, secondary leader of his party, had a comment and he took back that criticism in part later. But let's not go into an internal discussion here. my question is that what we see from presentations, especially perhaps from Bea and Gavin's presentation, but also from other presentations, that what we face here, that minorities, even in the internet age, have difficulties to create really strong self-representation. Sometimes it looks like the best can be if minorities can create a sort of self-empowering space where they can hang out, but how to reach the majority, it's a huge challenge. At the same time, both for businesses and political enterprises, it kind of pays well if they play racist things, because then it just draws audience, it gathers votes and stuff like that. So, and my question is that how can we figure out what would be your suggestions for some very well-reasoned, carefully tailored public policies, if there are some, which can somehow break those kind of bad motivations and logics and limitations? Because part of the picture seems to be that at least some of us don't necessarily trust our states a lot when it comes to regulating speech. So shall we still trust the states in some ways that they can do some good public policy? If so, I suppose probably not by limiting speech, but by promoting minority speech. But how to do that against those obstacles? Thank you.
Thank you. Third question here at the front, please.
Thank you. Matteo Mecacci with the Italian Parliament and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. I'm also focusing on the last presentation because we have short memory and we try to give precedence to what we remember most. And I'm just wondering, want to leave aside the issue of regulation of this kind of speeches and, you know, what is the situation in Hungary. I'm wondering what has been the reaction in the media? Because you mentioned that there was a reaction from civil society. I imagine also political parties of different nature might have taken a stance. Has this become part of the political debate? There was, in other sense, the space in the media to discuss about this, or was just the only message that reached the Hungarian population was this one? So there was no other way to counteract this kind of speech, apart from the regulation in the Hungarian state.
Thank you. If it's okay with everybody, I would like to take a few more questions because the first three are going directly to you, and I'd just like to get a few more people involved, and then we'll have an opportunity for the panelists to respond. There was a question here at the front, too, and I see a gentleman there, number 3 and 4. I'm not very good at maths. We'll take those 4, and then we'll maybe have a quick wrap-up round from the panelists. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dragana Nikolic-Solomon. I'm the head of the media department in Serbia. I just wanted to say we have talked a lot about minority media, but we haven't mentioned the word called editorial independence. We have not mentioned the word of financing. How are these outlets, at least in Serbia, I can tell you a lot about it, being financed? Are they in the hands of minority political parties? Can Hungarians, Albanians, Bosniaks, Croats be free from the parties who are dominating the councils, who are dominating the editorial independence? We had very detailed monitoring of the last election of in the minority media, where there is a very worrying sign that minority media parties are definitely there to own, finance, and influence editorial policy of the media they own. And maybe wider in the region, you see that Albanians are talking to Albanians amongst themselves. You see Serbs with Serbs. You see Hungarians with Hungarians. You see in Bosnia the 3 entities that have even their separate public services. So can we talk a little bit about, do we have any ideas about inclusion? Anything that, how can minorities communicate to majorities, and how can it be an inclusive society, not an island made of minorities who are governed in their small circles without being able to teach anything or to share anything with the countries they live in. That's it. Thank you.
My name is God. My name is Dan Baer, and I'm from the State Department, and I work in the Human Rights Bureau in Washington. I have two questions. One for the High Commissioner, which is, have you ever seen a case where a society in which prosecutions, widespread prosecutions for hate speech actually decrease social hostility? Because I have yet to see an empirical case where that's true. And there seems to be wide agreement in the room that what one should do with hate speech is to prosecute it. And I don't believe that I understand the instinct for it, but I don't believe that it's empirically borne out in a way that sustains a decrease in social hostility in society. And secondly, I think the last presentation, one of the things that I appreciate coming from anybody, first of all, I have sympathy for anybody in the Hungarian foreign ministry these days, because the record of the government in slowly dismantling, well, actually not that slowly, but dismantling some of the protections and the checks on power is quite worrying, as many have expressed. But I wonder if people could comment more widely than the media on how protections for other fundamental freedoms help reinforce the ability of minority populations to communicate through media and communicate with other populations.
I'm sorry, I'm not having a question, I have a statement. First, I have to congratulate Ms. Bodrogi to have the courage to present at the forum this outrageous, terrifying and scaring article. And I think that personally, I condemn it so much, and I am almost speechless. Because, sorry, my name is Zdzisław Gwóźdź, and I'm Polish-born Austrian, and I know that, for example, in Poland, it happens that settlements of Roma and Sinti are attacked, and so on, and even Catholic priests defending this. There is never protest and outcry enough in such cases. Thank you.
Oui. I'm Divina from Eggs, and though it doesn't seem it, I'm part of two minorities, one which is Corsican and one which is Catalan. Both minorities that had to recreate themselves from nothing through languages and through media. And I was wondering if in your research you had noticed things about diasporic media help from groups that are scattered around the world but can reinforce the local minority, especially because internet can be transborder. And maybe you have cases about Ireland. And also if you had noticed the phenomenon that is most apparent in the US, where there is, for the Spanish community, more power because of having a different language than, for instance, the black community, which has the same language. And as a result, three kinds of media appearing, the original Latin American one, the indigenous American one, and the sort of bicultural one, which is the emergence of sort of inclusive in a way. I wouldn't go as far, but an embryo of inclusiveness by having the hybrid minority get empowered by media and developing their own media. I was wondering if cases like that were happening in Europe. I'm just curious about that.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you who've contributed to the floor for your questions, comments, supplements, observations, and statement. Thank you all very much. What I suggest we do now is, starting with Bea, so reverse order, just give you the opportunity to respond to some of those contributions from the floor briefly. I think you will need a little bit more time than the others, but as we stand between everybody and the final break, I'd ask you to please be brief and powerful in your responses. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I will be very short. Just replying to your question, yes, the media dealt with the issue, but the issue became immediately as the part of the political games, so that the real issue wasn't going on in the media. To be fair, we have to talk about the journalists, that the self-regulatory bodies of the chief editors came up with a very good recommendations and a very good opinion of this article recently, a few days ago. And I really appreciate this, and I strongly believe in the self-regulation in this respect. So that's a response to Peter's question as well.
A response to two questions that touch upon what I was talking about. First, a question on how to develop public policies to break bad. Now we have that one. Yeah. Okay. How to develop policies to break these bad developments and these negative developments. Well, there are established policies that strive to enhance and encourage media development, and I would see two important fields. That is education in the media field. We have good examples. For example, in Estonia, the first course for Russian-speaking journalists has been opened by a university in Tallinn. I think that is an excellent example, going exactly in line with what the High Commissioner said, that you should be able to develop an understanding within the society by developing education and means within the society to get an understanding between groups that operate there, not to put them at the mercy of outside points of views that has earlier been the case. Another is financial support, and you'll find models for that in, for example, the aforementioned European Charter for regional or minority languages. Then when we do this financial support, and there we come to the question on editorial independence and financing. That's about financing. You need financing in the field, that's clear. And when states divide out financing, they should do it in a regulated way, in an objective way, in a transparent way, and in a way that supports editorial independence. That is also in line with what researchers in the field of exactly that kind of instruments have repeatedly been stating as the ground rule for how these kinds of systems should be developed.
I think I'll leave the question about diasporic media to Mirja, although I could say something about this in Ireland maybe at the reception or something else. I won't go into it now. Just a very short comment actually on what I was talking about the nature of analysing communications. When we have a statement like this and then we have a condemnation from someone within the same political party, my view would be that a condemnation by a political party of a statement like that involves expelling the person from the party. When somebody comes and corrects it, it's not a repudiation, it's a dialectic. In other words, what happens constantly in these political dynamics is somebody says something extreme, in other words, to set the boundary here, which creates the space for the next person to only go so far. And that's about creating racist common sense. So I wouldn't, again, take these two utterances at face value. They're part of a political dynamic. If people want to combat talk like that, then it has to exact a political cost. One of your colleagues saying he didn't really mean it isn't a political cost.
Thank you. I'll pick up a couple of issues, questions, and comments. I think different questions bring me to the same place that links to the question about the diasporic communities, but also the question about fragmentation. That what happens? Is the case that the more powerful minorities become in media spaces, do they end up looking inwards and to themselves? Which I think is an important question, but I think it's a question that we disproportionately focus on. And I just want to respond now to, I think the strongest evidence that I have about that, which is our research in 7 European countries with Arabic audiences, where we actually found out that indeed Arabic audiences in Europe watch a lot of Arabic television, but at the same time they watch European television. So 93% for our participants across 6 European countries said that they watch both Turkish and European television. What does that mean? That means, I think, that no matter how much fragmentation we see in media spaces, we don't necessarily need to make assumptions about the the breakdown of integration and participation in bigger public domains. And I think this is the case very often with diasporic groups. Indeed, I think diasporic groups or ethnic or linguistic minorities with links with different places, they tend to develop more vibrant media spaces because you have power in numbers in many ways. And what happens in this way, I think, is that we can see even more so how media spaces are both dynamic spaces and spaces of power struggles, which you rightly raise, questions of ownership, ideological struggles. Yes, these media, like every other kind of media, are locations of power struggles. And this will continue to take place. But the last point I'll say is that when we think, though, about those power struggles, we shouldn't just think about the power struggles on the top, but include also the users and the consumers, all those different people that might be spread around places, but also located in very specific places. Thank you.
Thank you. If I start with responding to the question I got from the friend from the State Department about if I had seen that widespread prosecution of hate speech had led to the decrease in social tension or hostility. Well, first of all, I haven't seen widespread prosecution against hate speech. But I agree with you that I'm not in favor of that. I'm not an overseas prosecutor. And I try actually in most of my contexts to say that I don't think negative measures actually promote minority rights or minority situation. They're more the positive incentives. At the same time, I think I have seen the negative effect of hate speech and the consequences of it. Like you could take a situation like Kyrgyzstan. There's no doubt that hate speech there was an instrument in the unrest and the situation we had in 2010. So it doesn't mean that we don't have to address hate speech. But I think I see hate speech more like as a symptom than a cause. It comes in a much wider context. So we may have, like in some of the cases mentioned here, we may have to address other causes, more root causes, than just attack the hate speech, or maybe do it at both at the same time, but not necessarily then through prosecution, but through another measures. If you allow me to just sum up what I've heard here, and I think this is a very important discussion actually, and I think it also shows both what the panel has raised and addressed, but also the questions and comments we've heard from you, is that it's extremely complex, and it's also contextual, of course, in spite of the fact that we have certain principles and baselines, but at the same time we have to put this in a cultural and social and political context. But maybe, if you allow me, 3 problems. One shouldn't end with 3 problems, maybe, but I think I still would like to do that, because I think these are problems that we have to address when we move forward. One is the ability of minorities to set up their own media. that is a problem. It has to do with financing that you have talked about, but it has also to do with regulations. In many countries, it has to do with language quotas, and also with the technical development. Digitalization is of course good, but it's also used in some of the cases I meet with as an excuse for not reaching out to the minorities because they are in the process of digitalization and it's so complex and all that. So this is a problem that we have to discuss. The other is access of minorities to information in media, because mainstream media ignore very often the specific problems of minorities, because the minorities are small, they are maybe settled in the specific areas of the country, they don't have a lot of financial power, so they are actually ignored, and this is a problem. And the third one then is the image of minorities portrayed in the media. They of course also become back to the hate speech, but it's not as dramatic as that, but it's also just stereotypes that one present, as we also heard, you talk about gypsy crime. I mean, you add the adjective gypsy to crime, and of course that present the stereotypes of an ethnic group. So to bridge these gaps somehow, I think, is the challenge we have, both as an international organization of the OSCE, but also the governments and the civil society, in order for minorities both to be presented in the majority media in a diverse way, because they are as diverse as the many of us, and also then for the majority media to be willing to and see the minority groups as a relevant group for them. Thank you.
Thank you all very much, and thank you in particular for ending with 3 problems. That keeps things going. What we've tried to do today, this afternoon, is provide you with a snapshot of the complexity of all these issues and how they come together. We will be taking this collective research endeavour forward, and if any of you would like to come and talk to us afterwards, we'd be delighted to hear from you. For now, thank you very much for your contributions. I'd like to thank all the panellists for their excellent contributions. And I would also, again, like to thank the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, first of all, for providing us with this slot, and then in pure organizational terms, thank you very much to the staff here in the background who've been doing an excellent job. It's been a long and warm day, so thank you very much for being so helpful and efficient. And again, all the experts here have very busy schedules, none more so than the High Commissioner, who often, I'm sure, doesn't know where he's going to be the next day because of the contingencies involved. So thank you all for coming here, and also to your office for the support for these issues over the past months, and we look forward to taking them forward. Thank you all very much.